good afternoon. My name is Ariel Fulland. I'm with the reference department, and I'm here to talk about to run the program, Start Your Art. This is going to be a resource guide for starting your art practice. So just to get some house cleaning out of the way, there's two big sections in this program. At the end of each section, I will open it up for questions that either in the chat, or you should have the ability to unmute yourselves if you want to ask questions through the mic. And so just at the start of this is going to be a lot of fun. We're going to learn a lot about different kinds of art and different types of mediums, and hopefully you'll get to learn how you can use the library to really get started with your art practice. So moving right along. So why start an art practice? So whenever you engage your creative mind, you are making connections between unrelated things. You're imagining things in new, different ways and to communicate. This is actually really good for you. In 2016, the Journal of American Art Therapy Association researched a group of 39 healthy adults. In these, they found that that just 45 minutes creating art in a studio with an art therapist around was enough to significantly lower their stress hormones. So they measured their stress hormones before making art, and then found that just after 45 minutes, their stress hormone had significantly reduced. They also found in that study that that stress reduction had no difference between people who identified themselves as experienced artists and people who felt that they had no experience making art. So what we can learn from that is that your level of experience, or how long you've been making art, or how good you feel at making art, it makes no difference. Just the act of creating is enough to reduce your stress. Starting an art practice can also produce what's called flow. Now, flow is a psychological term coined by the Hungarian-American psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. I don't think I pronounced that right, but I did my best. And so he found through his studies that when one enters flow, you're fully immersed in what you're doing in your task. If any of you have recently watched the movie Soul from Pixar, that moment and he's on the piano and he's feeling like he's in another world, this is a really good representation of what flow is. It is when you're fully immersed, you're in the zone, and you're feeling pure enjoyment from your task. Some components of flow include intense and focused concentration in the present moment. So you're not thinking about the future, you're not thinking about the past, you're only thinking about what you're doing. A merging of action and awareness, a loss of reflective self-consciousness, so you're not being reflective on your actions. A sense of personal control or agency in the situation or activity. A distortion, this is a really common one. Most people are aware of this one, is the distortion of temporal experience. Whenever you do a task and you've lost track of time, that's part of a state of flow. And of course, just the experience that the activity is intrinsically rewarding. Making art, that's sort of like the whole point, is making art, it makes you feel good. There is something intrinsically human about producing art. And it dates back to before antiquity, it's prehistoric. And what's great is that you don't even have to be good to experience its benefits. So with that much in mind, I'm going to open the floor a little bit to all of you. And if you want to either pop in the chat or go ahead and talk about what makes you, why you want to start your art practice. There should be an option to unmute. If you're not okay with sharing, that's totally cool. Awesome. Reduce stress. That's a really good reason. If there's somebody else, I'm going to go ahead and move on, and we're going to go start into and get into the good stuff and talk about different ways to make art. So the first one we're going to talk about, the first section we're going to talk about is drawing. Drawing, as you will know, is one of the oldest art forms of art. It dates back way back, and what's more about drawing is that it's something that everyone's done. Everyone's done a little bit of drawing, right? So like you've all, whether when you're a child, you drew pictures of your family or your house, or you're having fun with your friends. That's drawing. If you've ever found yourself bored and doodling in the margins, that's drawing. It is also one of the cheapest mediums for beginners. So all you need is a paper and pen or pencil, and you already have the basic tools that you need to create art and draw. Even to add to that, even if you want to have maybe more artistic materials, so like actual sketchbooks, or you want to have like artist tools or artist grade tools, they do tend to be on the cheaper side. So drawing is a really good way to just dive right in if money and be sort of money savvy about it. So we're going to cover 3 different media methods for drawing, and this will include ink, charcoal, and graphite. So ink is really cool. The first drawing ink appeared in China at about 3000 BCE. This early ink was a combination of like pine wood smoke and lamp oil and animal gelatins and skins. Like, it was probably not something we want to use today, but that's what they made it out of. And since then, like ink, there's lots of different, humanity's found lots of different ways to make ink. They can be made from a diversity of sources, like sooty carbon-based materials, to dyes from berries, to oak galls, insects, different animal bits. For more modern day inks, you can use, they're usually more soot based or carbon. Metal filings was a common use, and you can even find acrylic based inks. So it's not quite as like the little bits and bobs that we don't really want to think about. The most common ink is called India ink. It is still a popular ink that is used today. I think it's really funny about India ink is that it's actually a misnomer. India ink does not come from India. It is actually a Chinese, comes from China. And it was named that way because the British traded for it in India and decided that this was obviously Indian ink. So another something else, if you're taking to a more natural ink, is that black and white inks are the only permanent inks out there. Other inks that contain that are colored usually contain soluble dyes, and these dyes are not light fast. And now what light fast means is that they are not, if something is not light fast, that means when it's exposed to light, it will fade over time. So the UV rays in the light will cause the color to fade. So in terms of actually techniques and tips with ink, it all depends on how you're going to use your ink. The two main forms to use ink are, as demonstrated in this image, either with a stylus like a pen, or with a brush. So when you use a stylus or a pen, you can use the methods that's called hatching or cross-hatching. And this was because like pens are able to make those linear effects. The hatching is when you draw lines that are parallel to each other. And the closer you draw those lines together, the darker the effect, and vice versa. So if you put the hatches or the parallel marks farther away from each other, then you create lighter effects. So, and if you want for a more tonal or like more of a paint-like feeling, you would apply your ink with a brush. So this is really useful if you have water-soluble inks. So a lot of like soot-based inks, or if you ever done anything like calligraphy or Asian calligraphy, you use something called sumi ink, and then that is water soluble. And so when you add the water to it, you can actually lighten the color of the ink. And so this can create more effects of like shading, sort of like how the linear effect, the hatching with a pen tool creates the darker and lighter effects. So another medium is charcoal. Charcoal is actually one of the oldest drawing mediums. The oldest charcoal drawing dates back to 26,000 BCE. That is a long time ago. This actually, the drawing that we found is actually on this rock in Australia. I have the name of it, but I didn't learn how to pronounce it. I think it's Nawarla Gabarmung Aboriginal charcoal drawing. So it's pretty old. And that's pretty old for for an obvious reason. It's really easy to obtain charcoal. It can either be found as a regular stick or in a compressed form. It can be found in a powder. It can even be found in round squares or pencils, as we can see on the illustration here. Charcoal is a pigment that lacks a binder. So there's nothing to keep the pigment together. This, it's just loose. This can be really used to your advantage for two methods. So the first one is called stumping. And stumping is where you take either a soft stumping stick, which is usually a roll of paper that's pointed, or you can just take your finger. You don't need fancy tools, you got your hands. And you can just spread the pigment around your paper to create the effects. So if you want to shade in an area, or you want to lighten it or blend the color out on your paper, you can do that with charcoal because there's nothing to keep the pigment from sticking together. This is also the fact that it doesn't have a binder is really useful for erasing. So mistakes happen in art, they happen all the time. We'd like to think they don't happen, but they do. And so you can take your eraser to fix those mistakes really easily with charcoal. And not only that, like you can use your eraser to maybe add your highlights or make a lighter tone on your paper. So it's pretty handy for that regard. So the third kind is called graphite. Graphite is probably what we're all familiar with because we all had to get those #2 pencils on our school lists every year. Who remembers school lists? I do. So graphite is a crystalline form of carbon. Its name derives from the Greek word graphine, which means to write. So it's always been associated as a writing utensil or the particles of graphite are really small and disc-like. And so they lend themselves to being written on paper really well, which is why it's so common. It's really cool. Something I learned in my research for graphite was actually the fact that how the pencil came to be is actually a really interesting bit of art history. So it turns out during the Napoleonic Wars, Britain had had this monopoly on graphite, and there was an embargo on graphite toward the French because they were at war with each other. And so a man named Nicolas Jacques Conté was asked to figure out how to get around this graphite embargo with what they had. And he figured out how to take the graphite, make it into long rods with some graphite and clay, and encase those long rods in wood. And that's how that's when how the pencil was invented. And this was around 1794. However, graphite doesn't have to be in a pencil. It's the most convenient way to access graphite, but that's not the only way. As you can see, you can have it in uncased lead. You can have it in long graphite bars. There's even like on this illustration, there's even like just a chunk of graphite on the screen. And so there's more than one way. I think there's another way was like, it's really new is a liquid graphite. I actually have a tube of that. It's really fun. It's water soluble. So you can just take this little tube of liquid graphite, add a little water to it and like paint your pencil sketches. It's pretty neat. So the thing to keep in mind for technique wise is that graphite comes in various levels of hardness. We all were told to get those 2B pencils from good old Ticonderoga. Never really, and if you've ever wondered what 2B meant, it stands for hardness and for blackness. So the numbers on graphite represent how hard the lead is. The higher the number, the softer the lead. So that's all you need. It's all they mean. So a 2 is rather hard. The H also stands for hardness. So so if it's a 2H pencil, the lead's going to be rather hard. Now B, on the other hand, stands for blackness or boldness. So a B pencil will produce darker tones. So if you want to have those really dark shaded areas, you would use a B pencil. If you want an area that's really light, or if you're just doing a pre-sketch, you always want to do a pre-sketch that's lighter in tone because it's easier to erase for your mistakes. You would want to choose like maybe a 2H pencil so that it could produce a lighter tone. And so they just correspond with each other. So the 2 will be, a 2H pencil is harder than a 4H pencil. And so a 2B pencil has harder lead than a 4B pencil, but they will still be dark. So a really happy medium, if you just want to do a basic sketch, is either, there's always the 2B, or an HB is really your sweet spot for your basic sketches if you're not worried about tone or the hardness of your lead. So we actually have a lot of library resources for drawing. A lot of the resources I'm talking about today are going to be from our e-media, But I do want to go ahead and show you a resource from our e-courses, and that's called Creative Bug. So Creative Bug is really awesome in my opinion. They have video tutorials for arts and crafts. So I'm going to go ahead and show you how we navigate that. So for things like places like e-courses or databases, it's really important that you start at the library homepage. And all this does is so that when you access the links, it just makes sure that it sends you to a place that it's not going to ask you for money, because you never have to pay for any of the resources that are through the library. We've already paid for them with your taxpayer money. So to get to Creative Bug, you want to hover your mouse over the tab called Using the Library. And then you want to go to the section called Personalized Learning. And then we just go ahead and click on e-courses. And this will send you to a page that has all of our e-courses. And they're all in alphabetical order. And they're just, the Creative Bug is right at the top. I went ahead and took the liberty of going to Creative Bug previously. And what I did was I put in the foundational figure drawing. And this is what the tutorial looks like. It's just a video you can follow along. It has different chapters that you can look over to see if you want to skip into another section. And something that I really like, it's called materials. You can actually look and see what kind of materials they're going to be wanting you to use for the tutorial. So you can, before you even take the class or watch the tutorial, figure out what you need in order to follow along or in order to complete the activity yourself. There's also access to access to comments, so you can see what other people thought about the tutorial. And then there's a transcript that you can download as a PDF to tell you what's being said. And what's really cool is what I like about Creative Bug is that you can go ahead and let's say you don't have time. This looks like a really interesting class, but you just don't have time today. You might have time maybe this weekend. So you can just go ahead and add it to your watch list. And something I forgot to mention is that with Creative Bug, you do have to set up your own account. So that means when you log in, you do have to set up an account with your email and your password. And so that's why it's really important to access it through the library, because then that lets Creative Bug know, oh, they have a subscription. We don't need to charge them. You can set up your account with your email and your password. And as long as you remember it, you should be able to log in. And if you don't remember, it's pretty easy to change your password. So, okay, then I will go ahead and take this moment to take any questions we may have in the chat. While I'm waiting for some questions to come in, I did notice that a lot of other people put in why they wanted to start their art practice. I like MC Bradley, you make art part of your daily routine. I think that's a really noble idea. I think that's a great goal to have. Having a little art a part of your day is just, ah. And to Diane, yeah, art is fun. It's intrinsically fun. And with Belinda, yeah, it is a great way to escape the everyday, especially when you achieve that sense of flow that I talked about at the beginning. When you have that sense of flow, you just sort of lose sense and place because all that exists is you and what you're doing. It's pretty cool. I'm just going to give maybe 1 or 2 minutes and wait for questions to come in. All right, if a question does come in, I have the chat open and I will go ahead and read it, and I will answer it to the best of my abilities. But when, until that happens, I'm going to go ahead and move forward. So the second section is also a lot of fun, and that is painting. So we're all going back to this theme that art is really intrinsic. Just like drawing is something, drawing may be something that everyone has done. Painting is maybe not something you've done before. But it is an art form that's really old. We're all really familiar with the cave paintings of El Castillo or Lascaux that date back to 35,000 years before the Common Era. And painting, all painting is an arrangement of shapes and lines and colors and tones and textures on a two-dimensional surface. That is it. Like in that creating of those shapes and those textures and those tones, you're creating something that's aesthetic. You're creating an aesthetic image. So with just that, there are sheer variety of possibilities that you can make with just painting. There are two major forms of painting for art. The first one is representational. That is when you are painting something that exists in nature. So you paint a landscape, you paint a still life, you paint what's in front of you. Something that exists in here and now is representational. The other form, of course, is abstract. So this is when you mainly use geometric shapes to create this to create mainly and really with to create a feeling. So most abstract arts are stemming from the abstract expressionist movement, like they just want to create a feeling. So there are three methods of painting that we're going to be talking about. They're going to be watercolor, oil, and acrylics. And it's really fun because I accidentally put them in order from oldest to newest. So that's going to be an interesting art history journey on the way through. So watercolor. Watercolor is simply any paint in which color pigments are bound together in a water-soluble agent. So anything that can bind the pigment together and is soluble in water. In the past, these have been glues and sugars. Today we use gum arabic, which if you ever have the chance, side note, have the chance to look up gum arabic, it's pretty fascinating. Watercolors are actually the first kinds of paint that were used. So all those paintings you see in the caves at Lascaux or El Castillo were actually watercolors. They used more like an oak, charcoal or ochre or any easily obtained pigments and bound them together. During the 19th century, 18th and 19th century, watercolors became intensely popular in England to the point that entire societies were just stemming around them. As the idea of painting the watercolor landscape. Out of this came this, a lot of the techniques and a lot of the for watercolor painting that we still hold true today. So there are these traditional techniques, such as the most popular one is you don't use white watercolor. That's a very traditional technique that stems out of the watercolor societies of England. That I always thought that was interesting. It's still actually a point of contention today with watercolor artists of whether or not you should use white in your watercolor paintings. It's still a hot debate whether or not that's pure or not. So watercolor, getting to a more technical basis, watercolor is distinguished by its diversity of strokes. So there are many different ways you can apply the paint to the paper. And the way you do that can change the effect on the application. So for example, applying watercolor onto dampened color or dampened paper will create what's called a wet wash. And this will really produce those flowing passages of color and that may diffuse in these cloud-like edges or tide lines. So when you want that that beautiful flowery billowy cloud effect, you wet your paper first, and then you apply the watercolor on top of the paper or the wet paper to diffuse the color. By contrast, if you want something that's more defined, you would actually apply the watercolor to a dry sheet of paper or on top of dried color to really create that harshness and that non-diffuse look. So oil is actually the paint. When most people think of painting for fine arts, most people are thinking of oil paint. Oil paint has also got really popular because if you've ever watched Bob Ross used oil paints, and I will be talking a little more about him in this section, mainly because I love Bob Ross. So oil paint is actually a mixture of 3 types of ingredients: a pigment, a binder, and a thinner. So the pigment is obviously the source of color. The binder is the oil, which is most popular is linseed oil. I'll get to that to why that is in a moment. And this binds the pigment in a way so it makes a bit of a paste. And then the thinner is there added to lessen the viscosity, so make it easy to spread onto the canvas. A really common thinner is turpentine. Traditionally, so back in the day, traditional artists would make their own paints every day. They couldn't just go out and buy paints in a tube like we can. They would make them. And these paints could be very expensive depending on the value of the pigment. So a little bit of art history. The color ultramarine blue was traditionally made with a semi-precious stone called lapis lazuli. This is obviously very expensive. And so as a result, when you think of those you think of Donatello or Raphael or Leonardo da Vinci, like those Italian artists, you won't see a lot of blue in their paintings, or any of the oil paintings, because it was just so expensive to make. To a point that when the Dutch painter Jan Vermeer decided to paint the walls ultramarine blue, people were aghast, because essentially he was just painting money on the wall for art. But thankfully in the 19th century, we learned how to synthesize ultramarine and it got a lot cheaper. So what's really fascinating about oil is that it does, unlike watercolor or acrylics or any other paints, It does not dry through evaporation. Oils dry through oxidation. This makes them a really interesting medium because it allows you to take your time. So if you're in the middle of a painting and something comes up and you need to drop what you're doing and walk away, oil will still be there. It will still be wet when you get back. In fact, it will still be wet for up to 7 days on average. This is because of the kind of oil that's used. Linseed oil lends itself to drying through oxidation, which is why it's a really popular oil for oil paints. It also lends itself to the one of the techniques on the screen, which is wet on wet. So going back to Bob Ross, if you ever wondered how Bob Ross got those beautiful blends and those quick strokes, it's because he was using the wet on wet technique. Instead of waiting for the oil paints to dry, he was just adding wet paint onto wet paint onto wet paint. So as a result, you can get those really fabulous blends. You can stop for a couple hours or a couple days and come back. Obviously, if you do want to take time, if you want to create a separate layer, you actually have to wait until it dries to a good extent. This can be really good especially if you're stuck. I often get stuck on the middle of a painting. I don't know where I want to go with it. And so it's really helpful that with oil paintings, if I'm like, I know I want to add a new layer, but I don't know what, I have to take that time away because otherwise my layers are going to blend in together. So pretty cool. And last but not least is actually acrylics. So acrylics are near and dear to my heart. When I first started painting, I used acrylics. They're pretty inexpensive, and they're also the newest paint ever invented, like the newest one of the newer art forms created. So acrylics were invented in the 1940s, and when acrylic paints were first invented, they actually they were made with turpentine, and so they could be easily mixed in with oil paints. While contemporary artists like Mark Rothko and Lichtenstein were really intrigued by this, by the fact that they could mix acrylics with their oils. And so that's when they started really experimenting, and that experimentation led to its popularity. It is the most popular kind of paint to use when people, and part of the reason why acrylics are really popular is you can paint them on anything. Yeah, you can paint them on canvas, but you can also paint them on fabric. You can paint them on wood. You can paint them on paper. Hot tip, acrylic on watercolor paper is great because the watercolor paper will absorb the paint. You can paint it on wood. I think with the proper sealing, you can even paint it on glass. So it's just really versatile on its surfaces, which you can't say the same for things like watercolor or tempera or oil. Another thing about it's really great about acrylics is basically how it's used. Acrylics are water soluble, so that means you can add water to it to thin out your paint, and it can become more translucent like watercolors and have that that watercolor vibrancy. But you can also keep them thick like oils. If you keep it straight out of the tube, you can use a technique that's called impasto. That means that the paint is super thick. It's also the kind of painting technique that Van Gogh used to get those big globs of paint on the canvas. And so you can just use it straight out of the tube to get that kind of effect. You also have the option to use maybe more synthetic mediums. So a gel medium is a really good if you want to thin it out, but you don't want to have it that you still want to have it really thick and thick in consistency, or a thicker consistency than water. You can also use a medium called a glazing medium. This is really cool because when you add it to a glazing medium, you can actually create an overall tone. So like if you have this painting, you just want to have a haze of blue, you would use acrylics and you would use a glazing medium to create that hazy blue all over your painting. So for library resources for this painting, excuse me, for this section, I'm going to cover more of the e-media resources. So we do have a lot of ebooks on learning how to on different techniques for painting. These will come from Hoopla and Libby by Overdrive. And I just want to say that if you do use Overdrive or Libby, they're the same. You're the same account. Overdrive is just for your PC or your Kindle, and Libby is for your smartphone or your tablet. Otherwise, it's the same account, and you would use them the same way. And they also cross-reference. So I'm going to show you how you can access those. So there are two different avenues to access Overdrive. You could go through our website, and then hovering your mouse over books, e-media, and more, you would click on e-media. And then you would click on Overdrive. And so if you look up in the URL, this is the other way you can access Overdrive. If you just type in your address bar slcl.overdrive.com and put that in your address bar, it'll take you to the same place. So you don't necessarily have to access it through our website. And so all you want to do is just go ahead and type in the title of how to watercolor. And so this is a really so we actually have the Watercolor Artist Magazine. And then there's Everyday Watercolor. That is actually a really popular book that's I currently have on hold. Secrets to Watercolor. We have just a ton of resources that you can check out and have at your disposal, either on your computer or on your phone with Libby. So the other one I wanted to show, so like as you notice with Overdrive, is that a lot of those books you have to say what's called place a hold on that. And so when you place a hold on a book, for example, it's basically what it's saying is we have only 3 copies of this book. And so we don't have access to it. So you need to place it on a hold, sort of like how you put a physical book on hold. So Hoopla is pretty great, but anything that you find on Hoopla is automatically can be checked out to you. Now this is why, but as a result, this is why you only get 10 titles per month. So rather to keep the costs on the taxpayers to a minimum, because Hoopla is pay to play. So to keep costs on taxpayers to a minimum, we've limited it to that 10 titles per calendar month. And that's really important, that it's not every 30 days, it's a calendar month. So you can wait till the end of the month and just use all of your 10 titles and they will still be good. And then you wait till the beginning of the new month, you get 10 more. It's pretty cool. And so just by clicking on Hoopla, so with something to keep in mind with Overdrive is that you would log in with your library card and your PIN. And that's what makes it super easy. As long as you know your PIN and your library card, you can sign into your account. By contrast with Hoopla, you do actually need to set up an email account and a password. And so then you would just type, once you've set that up, you would go ahead and type in your login information. And then you'd be able to find different titles. So, and like I said, these titles would you be able to check out automatically. There is no wait times. So I can go ahead and borrow this. We don't have a limit. So like any of you can can log on right now and you can borrow it as well. So, and just start reading. It's pretty darn nifty. Okay. So I'll go ahead, and this is the end of the second section. I will go ahead and open the chat if you want to answer any or ask any questions you may have had on any of the techniques or methods that I talked about, or in this section, or anything about Hoopla or Libby. I'd be happy to help you. And so while I'm waiting for that, I do want to let you know that I will be sending a PDF of today's slides, so you can find all these titles that I have recommended for you and have access to them if you become interested, or if you want to know what any of the Creative Bugs tutorials that you can access. Well, if you don't have any questions, or if one comes up, I'll make sure I'll answer it in the chat. We're almost done, so that moved really fast. I hope you're having a lot of fun. I certainly am. So just to wrap up, the final thing for today I want to talk about is to get inspired. So knowing about art history, knowing about the techniques for different mediums, that can carry you so far. But then you want to make art, you need to be inspired. And inspiration can come from just by, a lot of the artists get inspiration by looking at other artists. So something that I would keep in mind for online is you can go to Google Arts and Culture. This is really fun, in my opinion. It's supposed to be able to click, but so Google Arts and Culture, they actually show you different, have different exhibits of art and art from art museums that you can explore. I think just last night when I was looking at it, there was something about seeing Monet up in detail. So being able to zoom in on those Monet paintings and see those individual strokes that closer than you would be able to at the art museum. Of course, art museums are a great way to go and get inspiration. So if especially since we're all still practicing social distancing, there are virtual museum exhibits. I do believe the St. Louis Art Museum has a series for in Bloom. They have their flower virtual exhibit that they're advertising. So that's something you can explore. Another place you can visit for virtual museum exhibits is the Metropolitan Museum of Art. This is also known as the Met. They have a lot of exhibits up on their website that are available for you to peruse. They have a lot of interesting information and education if you want to learn more about those particular art, that art genre. In fact, a lot of the information that I got from the drawing and the watercolors actually came from a blog they had on different drawing mediums, and I highly recommend that you check it out. And of course, you can always use social media. So browsing Instagram, a lot of artists post their art on Instagram. It's a great way to know what's happening in the here and now, what artists are selling, what artists are producing. and you can get and like you can follow those artists and feel inspired by them or really admire what they're creating. So I want to ask once again, I'm taking it over to you. I want to know what inspires you, and I also want to know if of all the things we talked about, what you want to try. So go ahead and let me know what inspires you. What do you want to? What do you want to? What are you inspired to try from today's session? Oh, wow, that's awesome. So you're following 50 artists. That's amazing. It is, and I agree, it is amazing. So many of the accounts I follow are art accounts, and they're just so cool. Yeah, but I do follow little things like that. But like yeah, I do follow a lot of artists. And what's really cool is I have a friend who's an artist, and she gives me more artists to follow. We just sort of like feed each other like different artists that to go. Yes, I agree. And see, Bradley, it is a great way to find inspiration and for new techniques. So I'm also curious of like what you want to try. Like, if there's anything like I personally, when I started my art practice, I was originally very intimidated by watercolors to a point that I took an art class and the art teacher was like, "You should try watercolors," and I looked at her and said, "No." But I found that like I finally found myself being in a place that's brave enough to try it, and I actually do like them a lot. So I'm really curious if there's anything we talked about that you haven't tried. Okay, so watercolor. Oh, you're gonna try gouache. That's really interesting. Gouache is like has those different properties. It's like watercolor, but it's a little more, but obviously more opaque. So yeah, doing art daily, even a couple doodles. Yeah, that's what's great about drawing, right? It's like I should probably mention that too. It's really convenient. So if you want to get that art practice and you only have a sliver of time, you can just doodle something. That's great. Thank you so much, guys, for sharing this. It's really awesome to hear people's ideas and what they're trying out. Trying to conquer painting bumblebees. That's really interesting. I'm just so you know, like if it makes you feel better, bumblebees are like the least aggressive bee. So like you got a good chance. And an art, yeah, that's really cool. And an art journal is really good. We actually do have books on art journaling as well, if any of you are interested in that. So that's something you can try that you can use the library for as well. That's really cool. I want to thank you all for sharing all your ideas and all your thoughts. That's it really livens up and it gives me a little break of, just me blabbing on. So this is really all I have for you today. If you do want to learn more, you can always talk to us. We love to hear from patrons. You can contact us by calling the library at our phone number at 314-994-3300. You can also email us at reference@slcl.org. You can email any of our questions. You can also chat us. That's really cool if you just go to our homepage. And then if you go to the research page, and that little chat button right there, it will lead you to a person that you can chat with. We are real people. We are not bots. So that's always fun. And then if you ever have a research project in mind, or you realize you want to use more of our resources, but you're not quite sure how, you can schedule an in-person, socially distanced book a librarian appointment online. So I want to thank you all for attending. I hope you learned a lot from it, a lot today, and you have a wonderful day.